Hi, I'm Gina, Projects and Operations Manager.
And I'm Anjali, the Compost Hub's Program Manager.
And we're going to teach you about how to compost at home.
This workshop will cover methods of composting that you can do at home.
If you're unfamiliar with composting and you're a complete beginner, we recommend watching our Composting at Home video first.
And if you're already familiar with compost basics, then you're ready to start learning about some of the composting methods that we're going to be discussing today.
So we'll be discussing hot composting in bins, in tumblers, vermicomposting, and Bokashi.
And don't worry if that sounds like a lot of words that you may not be familiar with. We're here to break it all down for you. So I think we're ready to get started, Gina.
Let's get started. Composting is an ancient practice that's occurred all over the world with many different styles and methods. Hot composting, or thermophilic composting, is the most common form of composting. It requires the balance of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water, and when you bring those materials together, the microorganisms can thrive and decompose at their most optimal rate. Hot composting can take place in a variety of bins and styles. Today we're going to be showing you some of the more common and popular options, including wire bins, tumblers, and open piles. All three of these systems use the same lasagna layering process, which is simply stacking all of your materials to create the most optimal conditions for your microorganisms to thrive. So we're going to show you how to set up your bins and how to layer them, and then how to maintain them. Let's get started. All right, so the bin that we're going to be demoing with today is this wire bin. This is something that you can make DIY at home. It's simply a piece of hardware cloth clasped together on each end to form a circle. You can make it as tall as you want, as wide as you want. We recommend at least 3 by 3 by 3. So today we're using a slightly smaller version just for demonstration purposes. The process, like we said earlier, for any other stackable plastic bin or tumbler like we'll show in a minute, is going to use the same lasagna layering process. As you're setting up your bin, we have a few recommendations for choosing your spot. First, it's best to place your bin in part shade or a shady spot so that it can help retain and conserve water. This is going to be good for water conservation and also for the microorganisms. The second important thing is making sure that there's lots of space to move around your bin. You want to be able to have space to aerate your pile or even take materials out as you're processing and maintaining your compost pile. And then finally, we recommend choosing a spot close to a water spigot. Since you'll be watering your pile regularly, you will make your life a lot easier just by being close to that water source. So now that we've selected the best location for our compost bin, now let's talk about the ingredients. So let's start with carbon. Carbon can be a mulch, so basically any organic material that's no longer living. It can be pieces of bark, leaves, branches, twigs, types of material that comes from tree trimmings. Another very common carbon source that people use for backyard or at-home composting is newspaper shreds. So this is something that you can recycle in your compost bin. We just recommend ripping it up into pieces no bigger than the size of your hand. It'll help decompose faster. The second key ingredient is our nitrogen source, so most commonly known as food scraps. We recommend for backyard composting to focus on fruits, vegetables, eggshells, and coffee grounds. Although meat, dairy, and oils can be composted, as they break down, they tend to release some foul odors. So for preventing any pests and also preventing any odors in your yard, we recommend just keeping those out, especially as you're starting out. There's lots of ways to collect your food scraps. Some people like to collect their food scraps in the freezer. You can use a small reusable container, you can use a paper bag, any type of vessel that fits in your freezer. Some people also like collecting food scraps in a large bucket. Whichever you prefer, we recommend keeping your food scraps no more than about a week so that they aren't decomposing and creating odors in your home. So we got our bin set up, we got our materials ready, and we have Anjali back with us to help start layering. So the first thing when we layer is we want to start with a layer of our browns or our mulch. That's our carbon source. I'm going to grab a handful of this material, and we always start with mulch at the bottom to create a nice aerated base. On your bottom layer, you can go anywhere from 2 to 4 inches so that you have a nice thick layer at your base. The next step is we want to water our mulch. Like we mentioned earlier, water is one of the key ingredients of composting. So if we water each layer, we ensure that we are incorporating water throughout the pile. Thank you, Anjali. Awesome. Now we're ready for our food scraps. So we can just dump our layer of food scraps right on top of that mulch base. And we can flatten it out a little bit. Perfect, just creating a nice even layer. So even though we made our first pile a little bit thicker, now we're gonna go for 1 to 2 inch layers. So we did about an inch layer of food scraps, and now we're gonna follow that up with another layer of mulch. For lasagna layering, we recommend equal volume layers of food scraps to browns. And we'll give that layer of browns another bit of water. Awesome. And then we'll just keep putting layers, 1 to 2 inches of food scraps, 1 to 2 inches of mulch until it's all the way to the top. So after you've added your food scrap layer, you want to always ensure that your top layer is of browns. There's a couple reasons why we do this. Number one, the layer of browns will help to suppress any odors as the food scraps decompose, in addition to prevent any pests from being able to smell the material and become attracted to it. So it's really important that our top layer is always browns, mulch, and then add a little bit of water on top just to lock in some of that moisture. So now that we've filled our bin about halfway, we're ready to aerate. To aerate, you can use a pitchfork like I have here. You can use a garden fork. There's also different products available that are specific compost aerators. So use whichever tool you prefer. To aerate, you want to stick your tool into your bin and just gently agitate the materials. This will allow proper airflow, ensure that the pile does not become anaerobic, and make it so that we're spreading the microorganisms through the pile. As you aerate, you can also add more water. Adding more water to some of the parts of the pile that had not received moisture will also ensure that your pile is fully moist. So another great composting tool is having a composting thermometer. When you're about halfway full, or let's say about a few weeks into your compost pile building, you'll want to check the temperature of your pile. The temperature will indicate to you how active the microorganisms are, in addition to if your original recipe is creating the conditions for decomposition. So in the active phase, 2 to 3 weeks after you begin to add your materials, you should start to see the temperatures increasing. Again, depending on the frequency, the materials, and your recipe, it could take up to a month to see those temperatures really spike. When composting is at its most active, it's about 130 to 150 degrees. You never want your pile to get over 155 degrees because we actually may start killing off some of the beneficial microorganisms. So when you check your compost temperature, you want to make sure that your temperatures are in the optimal range. Aerating can additionally help to adjust a pile that might be heating up too much. Water can help to increase pile temperatures as it supports microorganismal life. And you can always adjust your recipe slightly if you're noticing that the temperatures are not reaching the point that you want. So the wire bin is one method. Like we mentioned earlier, there's tons of different bins, systems, chambers, and different methods that you can compost in. One of the best ways to compost, especially if you have the space, maybe a backyard or a large enough area, is to just compost in an open pile. You don't need any materials. All you might want is a tarp just to cover the materials. But it's something that you can do for almost little to no cost. So we're gonna demonstrate how you can do an open pile. Just like this. You'll have a nice little mound. You wanna create a nice 3x3x3 pile, in addition to making sure all of these food scraps are covered. Another popular composting system is the Tumbler. The Tumbler sometimes comes in a single chamber and sometimes is a double chamber, like the one that we have here. Because of its size, tumblers typically don't get as hot as some of our stacked lasagna systems, but it's a super efficient and great way to incorporate composting at home. To use your tumbler, you'll open up one of the chamber doors. I recommend doing the same as we did in our lasagna system by starting with a layer of mulch to create a nice aerated base. So we've already added the mulch into this bin here, and now we're ready to add our food scraps. Simply pour in the food scraps through the little door, and we'll do the same thing, grabbing a layer of mulch to ensure that the food scraps are not showing. This will help to prevent any fruit flies or any odors. Once you've added your food scraps, and added an additional layer of mulch, you can also give your tumbler a little bit of water. Be careful of adding too much water in these systems since they don't have very much drainage. You want to be mindful, just get it a little bit moist but not too wet. Once you've added your water and your layer of browns on top, you can go ahead and close the window. And just like we aerated after our wire bin got about halfway full, we're gonna do the same thing with the tumbler. So once your tumbler bin gets about halfway full, you can give it a turn. This is essentially mimicking the same aeration process that we did in our wire bins. So it's important that we tumble pretty regularly. We recommend using these double chamber systems because you can fill up this entire bin. Again, depending on the frequency and the amount of material that you're adding into the bin, it could take up to a month or two. So once you finish filling this bin, we recommend pausing and then moving over to this bin so that once these materials in our yellow side have broken down, we'll be able to harvest it and this material will start filling up. So compost is ready when it's no longer hot, the temperatures are ambient, and you see this nice, dark, rich, chocolate brown color. Once it's finished, you'll also not be able to see any visible food scraps. Sometimes you'll see pieces of eggshells or larger sticks, but you can always sift those out. In addition to this organic matter is super healthy for your soil.
What is Bokashi composting? Bokashi refers to the pre-composting fermentation process that starts with bran. The bran is derived from rice and is enriched with highly effective microorganisms. Bokashi's origins are from ancient Korea and Japan. This compost style is more of a pre-fermentation process which happens due to a special bacteria. Something else to keep in mind is that Bokashi is an anaerobic fermentation process that doesn't require airflow. A benefit of choosing the Bokashi composting style is it can easily process meats, dairies, bones, and fish without attracting pests. All right, now that we've talked a little bit about what Bokashi is, where it's from, and how it works, let's talk about what we need to get you guys set up to start doing Bokashi composting at home. Some of the things that you need for a successful Bokashi bin is just essentially any type of bin that has a locking lid that can seal shut. You can use a bucket with a lid, or you can use one of those storage containers that has the locking lids on the side. Today what we're gonna be using is a Bokashi bin that we purchased online. All we have to do is simply open the lid, take our food scraps, and add them to the bin. So I'm just gonna go ahead and shake that in there. All right. Now, remember this compost system, you can also add bones, meats, dairies, fish. Now all we need to do is add our Bokashi bran. So this is that inoculant that has those highly effective microorganisms that's gonna actually start the fermentation of your food scraps. So all you do is you take a handful and then you come and you just sprinkle them here on top of your food scraps. I'm gonna do about 3 handfuls just to make sure that all of that Bokashi bran is really sitting on that nice top layer of the food scraps. After a week or so, you'll actually start noticing that your food scraps will start decreasing in size. That's actually really great because it shows you that the fermentation process has begun. Something else that's great about the Bokashi bin is that it really helps you keep down on smells for 2 reasons. The Bokashi bran, because it's that inoculant, it's taking away some of those smells, but in addition, you can always have your lid to keep all of that stuff sealed, all of those scents sealed off. After your food scraps have sat in your Bokashi bin for about 6 to 8 weeks, you can add that material to a compost pile where it can continue to finish decomposing properly, or you can actually dig a hole in the soil and add your material directly to that hole. Just make sure to cover it back up so that you don't see any exposed food scraps when you walk away. You can also make your own Bokashi bran if you prefer not to purchase it, as long as you acquire those effective microorganisms. And you don't have to use rice bran, you can also use wheat bran and molasses. If you're interested in learning more about that process, definitely check out the Japanese Community Cultural Center in Little Tokyo, as they have an amazing Bokashi composting workshop.
Let's talk about vermicomposting. Vermicomposting, also known as worm composting, is a great option for small spaces and even indoors. Worms have no eyes. They breathe through their skin, and they like moist conditions under 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Worms have beneficial microorganisms in their guts, so as they eat, they excrete a nutrient-dense, high nitrogen material that we call worm castings. Worm castings are super high in fungi. They also can be disease suppressive, and they are great for use in compost tea. When you use worm castings in your garden, you really only need about half the amount as you do regular composting, since they're so dense in nutrients and plant growth hormones. Let's go get our worm bin set up. Like all type of composting, there's many different ways that you can keep worms and do vermicomposting. Today we're going to demonstrate with a stackable system, which are very common. There's also different types of systems you can purchase or you can make yourself. The most important thing is that there's drainage, both on the top and on the bottom. Worms need moisture, and they also need oxygen to breathe. So both of this drainage and holes is going to allow for there to be good airflow for them to breathe, and also ensure that it doesn't get too soggy if we accidentally add too much moisture or water. So to start our worm system, the first thing that we need to do is set up a bed for our worms. Just like we all like to be comfortable, the worms want to be comfortable as well as they start to enter their new home and environment. So there's a couple of materials that are great to use as bedding. The first material is coconut coir. Coconut coir can be purchased at most nurseries. It's a material made from coconut husks, and it's highly porous. In addition to, it retains water incredibly well, so it creates a great environment for worms. So the first thing that we want to do with setting up our worm bin is add our bedding. So we're going to add our bedding to the second layer. This specific system, like a lot of other stackable systems, has a base at the bottom, and then it has a layer that has holes in it. So we're going to add the bedding to the layer with the holes, because it'll ensure that our worms have good drainage. So after we add our coconut coir, we're just going to level it out, make a nice flat layer. Another great material for worm composting is shredded newspaper. Worms love shredded newspaper. It's great to also add the shredded newspaper as a bedding, and you can also add it to the top. The top, just like how we capped off our hot composting systems with browns, it's great to cap off your worm composting system so there's no exposed food. So you can use more bedding, you can use finished compost, or you can use newspaper. So now that we've put in our bedding of either coconut coir and newspaper, or a combination of both, we're ready to add our worms. It's also important as we set up our bedding that we water. Worms need to be in a very moist environment, so we want to make sure it's super moist before we add our worms. So now that we've set up our bedding, we're ready to add our worms. Like we mentioned earlier, we're going to use red wiggler worms. We are transplanting these worms from another system, but you can also purchase worms online if you're starting out brand new. So this material has some worm castings mixed in. But if you're buying it online, it might just be straight worms without any other substrate. So whichever one it is, you want to just use a scooper and add in your worms. These scoops have tons of worms in every scoop. And for a brand new system, you can add anywhere from 250 to 500 worms to start out. They will reproduce very quickly as long as they're under the proper conditions and they're being fed and they're thriving. So now that we've added our worms, I just want to level it out. All right, so now that we've got our worms set up, we gave them a little bit of water just to make sure that we're incorporating moisture throughout our worm bin. So now we're ready to feed them. When you're starting out with worms, we recommend feeding them super water-heavy foods at the beginning, especially as they get adjusted to their new environment. You want to make sure that the food that we're giving them is super easy to digest. So we recommend fruits, leafy greens, anything that has a lot of water in it. So we're going to add some of these leafy greens into our worm bin, and we're just going to distribute it along the top. You can dig them in a little bit, again, just so that they're a little bit more easily accessible for the worms. And then we're going to use some of our newspaper shreds to cover the top and make sure that there's no food scraps showing. So as the worms start to eat the food, what's going to happen is, like we mentioned earlier, they're going to start making castings. So as they eat the food and as they eat some of the finished compost that we put in our bin, the bin is going to start filling up more and more with castings. So what's going to happen in these vertical systems is that the castings and the leachate will fall to the bottom, and you continue to add the food onto the top, and the worms will eat the top surface, and then slowly over time those castings will be produced and fall down to the bottom. You can always add additional trays if you'd like to, but for the most part they'll just keep eating, and then you'll be able to harvest your worm castings once you notice that all of them have kind of been eaten through. Once that happens, you can pull your worms out, and then you'll want to just start over from scratch, making your bedding and adding food, and start over again.
So now I want to show you guys how to utilize some of that amazing compost that you will be able to produce after going through your first round of composting at home. So one of the first methods that I'm going to show you for utilizing your finished compost is just by simply utilizing it as an amendment and as a seasonal fertilizer for your existing plants and trees. So I'm going to do a little sample of that here. We have a houseplant here. Houseplants love compost. And essentially, you can just simply sprinkle a little bit on top and just kind of scratch it into the soil here. And that will definitely help your plants to hold on to more water and give them a nice nutrient boost. Another great way for utilizing finished compost is for starting new seedlings. So you can easily take some of your finished compost, sifted or unsifted, and you can mix it with some of your potting soil. This really gives new seeds and seedlings a great boost. On average, I usually try not to use more than about 20% of this organic matter mixed in with my soil, but it's definitely a great way to utilize finished compost. Another awesome way to utilize finished compost is when you are transplanting a plant or a tree. For example, if you have a house plant in your home and you want to move it to a larger pot because it's a little bit stressed out, utilizing this finished compost will definitely help alleviate any of those stressors. And another way that I love to use finished compost, which I think is a little creative, is by making compost tea. So this is not a tea that we drink, but definitely for our plants and trees. You can simply we have a sweet little burlap bag here, and we actually used worm castings today to make our compost tea here. But essentially you can use a burlap bag, you can use an old sock, an old pantyhose, cut it, go ahead and put your finished material in there, drop it in a bucket of water. On average, you want to let this sit for about 24 to 48 hours, and then always make sure just to keep that material aerated. So you want to make sure that you're mixing that tea bag in there, maybe twice a day over the course of 24 hours. That essentially is just to keep oxygen within your compost tea. And then after, you're left with this really beautiful, highly inoculated magic tea that will give your plants and trees a great boost. Another way to utilize compost tea is by turning it into a foliage spray. So if you've ever had pests in your gardens like aphids or powdery mildew or anything that's attacking your plants or trees, this is actually a really great way to utilize your compost tea. Add it to a spray bottle and use it as your foliage spray. Improve the fertilities of your soils by adding compost in one of these different ways.
Thank you so much for learning and composting with us today. We hope that you feel equipped, empowered, and ready to start composting at home. For any more information and resources as you embark on your compost journey, check out lacompost.org.
And remember, the compost process is very forgiving. The 4 ingredients are always the 4 solutions, so you got this.
Happy composting!